Welcome everyone to our February 2026 Climate and Health Learning Series today with Dr. Matt Burgess from the University of Wyoming. Before I get to Matt's introduction and turn things over to him, I just wanted to remind everyone that we've got a couple other events coming up. On February 19th at the Egyptian Theater, we'll be showing a film festival with 3 films from Protect Our Winters talking about what is causing the snowpack loss that we're seeing and how that's having ramifications on our health and our economic environment. We are also looking forward to our March, April, and May speakers for the spring lecture series. In March, we'll have 2 infectious disease doctors talking about how infections are emerging in the setting of climate change and how we can be more sustainable in our healthcare practices through better antibiotic stewardship. In April, we'll have an in-person speaker, though the location is to be determined, a pediatric endocrinologist from NYU talking about plastics and their impact on human health and how humans are driving the plastic crisis. And then in May, we'll have a speaker talking about choosing wisely guidelines in Canada and how Canadian healthcare has looked at improving clinical care by reducing the amount of unnecessary tests that are done and how that's improving our carbon footprint in medicine. So today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Matt Burgess, an assistant professor of economics at the University of Wyoming. His research focuses on economic growth, futures, and their implications for the environment and society, political polarization of environmental issues and higher education, and natural resource management. He writes the Guided Civic Revival Substack and hosts the Grounded But Not Divided podcast. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Matt.
Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. How many PhDs does it take to press the mute button? Thank you, Elle, for having me. Dr. Sims, thank you for the invitation. Big part of my work these days is on long-run economic growth patterns and their implications. And this is broadly the pattern that we're going to talk about. So before the Industrial Revolutions, GDP per capita growth controlling for inflation and cost of living differences in the world was basically zero, very, very, very little. Then we had this growth explosion, industrial revolutions. I'm plotting a 21-year moving average, so you can't see the business cycle. So that smushes the world wars and the Great Depression together in here. Can you all see my mouse? Oh, that's wonderful. Then what looks like 2 more peaks and valleys here is really just a unimodal peak in the rich world and another unimodal peak in China and India that are just kind of offset in time and make it look like the world has had these 2 peaks. And these dotted lines are IPCC scenarios, which are based on major economic scenarios from other agencies like the OECD and expert opinion among macroeconomists. And you can't do a 21-year moving average in the last 10 years of your data. So I plot basically a linear trend through the year-to-year growth up to 2021, which is when we wrote this paper. Obviously, it's dragged down a little bit by the 2 big global recessions that we had in that period. But nonetheless, the modal or median trend is still tracking on or even slightly below the most pessimistic of the major economic scenarios. And I'm going to argue that there's a lot of implications for this for climate change, for health, for democracy, and for a lot of other things that we care about. Okay, good. All right, so just a quick diagram of what's the link between economic growth, climate change, and health, because that's the topic of the talk today. So the way to read this is the orange things are roughly representing directions of causality that are going counterclockwise, and the blue things are representing directions of causality that are going clockwise. So economic growth affects the technology that we have, the rate at which we develop technology, the amount of fiscal space that we have to spend public money on big projects, because more growth is more money is more revenue for the government, all else equal. It affects the infrastructure we have and how fast it turns over. And you should care about how fast the infrastructure turns over for both mitigation and adaptation, if you're talking about any energy transition or resilience to climate change. more growth you have, you also tend to have, I'll talk about this more specifically in a second, less of a zero-sum economy, more of a sense of opportunity, more of a sense of optimism, maybe particularly among young people, and that has benefits for social cohesion and democracy. Health, if all is equal, we're healthier, we're more resilient to climate change. Maybe there should be other bullet items there, but maybe that's the one where my expertise is thinnest. Climate change, affects the economy through things like impacts on crops, water, infrastructure, productivity. That's not an exhaustive list. Climate change effects on health affect the economy. Then going the other way, right? Starting from economic growth. So economic growth creates our emissions until we decarbonize the economy. Also helps us develop technology, which is used to mitigate and adapt. And the richer we are, the more adapted we tend to be to climate and weather-related challenges. Climate change affects health through things like pollution, fire, and air quality, disease, particularly tropical diseases in some places, and mental health. Although I'm going to argue that the mental health issues related to climate change we see here, although severe, are probably caused more by the narratives about climate change than they are caused by the direct impacts of climate change. If you just look at the numbers, feel free to push back. That's maybe my big provocation for today. And labor quality is one of several ways that health affects economic growth. A healthier society has higher quality labor, more productivity. Okay, so I want to tell you 3 stories about economic growth, and mostly I'm an optimistic person, and this is an optimistic talk, but this is, I think, the one kind of scary part of the talk. And basically, I want to tell you 3 stories that are not mutually exclusive, and you might want to worry if 2 or more of them are true. So, and I've represented these stories in this slide by 3 books that are famous books in the tradition of this literature, this narrative. So Benjamin Freedom's The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. The basic story is growth is not just important to our material progress, it's also important indirectly to our moral progress in advanced democratic societies. The Case for Degrowth by Georgos Kallis et al. Basically argues that growth is environmentally unsustainable, and we've already overshot our limit, and therefore we need to shrink the economy on purpose to get it to be sustainable. And then Fully Grown by Dietrich Vollrath is one of a few books that basically argues that growth is, this pattern I showed in my first slide, right? Growth is slowing down is something that is largely caused by deep structures that have nothing to do with the environment and are going to be very hard, if not impossible, and he particularly argues would be undesirable to reverse. And so my basic argument at the start of this talk is that if Friedman is right and either of these 2 other guys are right, we've got a problem. Okay, let's a couple of high-level highlights from the specifics of these stories and some nuances. So economic growth has been essential to material and moral progress. I think it's pretty obvious that if average incomes are higher, average incomes are higher. So I'm not going to show you that graph. It has a perfect one-to-one correlation. The graph I'm showing here on the left is showing that the capita income in countries' poorest quintile, so basically the poorest 20% on average in a country, has a very strongly positively correlated income to the per capita income of the whole country. This is from one of a series of papers by Dollar and Craig called Growth is Good for the Poor, and then later followed up by Growth is Still Good for the Poor. And the point is just that, the people who say that we need to limit growth for sustainability reasons, the answer to, well, what's that going to do to the poor is often, well, we're going to find our ways to share our resources better so that the poor can be richer, even though overall we're going to be poorer. And the basic lesson I draw from graphs like this is that that's basically never happened before. Not only that, the government systems that have arguably tried the hardest to do it are the single deadliest systems of government in human history, the communist ones. And so we better have a very good reason for why we think we can kind of be over here in the graph when no one has ever done that. There's an old adage that money doesn't buy you happiness. If you change the word happiness in that sentence to life satisfaction, it's unfortunately not true. So this graph is plotting, each line represents the 5 quintiles of income within a country. And the point is that self-reported life satisfaction and is very strongly correlated with income per year, both within countries, meaning the lines mostly point in the up and to the right, and across countries. And there's interesting revealed preference estimates of that in immigration too. There's a very strong correlation between net migration flows and differences in GDP per capita. Okay, let's talk about moral progress. So this graph on the top. I made it when I was a postdoc, and it scared me. And then 3 years later, I published a paper on it. And then 5 years later, the Financial Times picked it up like a week or two ago. And basically what we're showing here is that this is the same growth curve that I showed in my first slide for the world on the top for just the OECD countries in their defined by their 1990 membership. So basically the North America, Western Europe, Western offshoots, and Japan. And what you can see is, everyone's heard of Athens and Rome, but as a fraction of the world population in blue, basically nobody lived in a democracy until the economy started growing, and the rise of democracy correlates very strongly with the rise of growth. Correlation isn't necessarily causation. There's a whole literature trying to explore the causation that suggests that there is some, and to some extent in both directions. In rich countries, like I said, these what looks like two peaks in global growth are really just two superimposed unimodal peaks in today's rich countries and then in today's middle income countries later. And we're entering potentially this period of ever slowing per capita growth where we try to sustain democracy, and that's an unprecedented situation that's relatively new in the context of the history of Western democracies. And the broad reason why growth, in particular, not wealth and affluence too, but also specifically growth, is important to democracy, is that if the pie is growing, then the economy isn't zero sum. And the faster it's growing, the more easy it is to find ways to allocate our resources that make everybody's boats rising. Whereas if we weren't growing, if our growth was exactly zero, then in order to make one person richer, you would necessarily have to make somebody else poorer, and that makes the society more zero sum, more internally competitive, which, as I'll show in a second, tends to correlate with division. So here are a couple of specific measures of social things related to growth. One thing that's not on here is rights for women and minorities tend to improve during periods of high growth. That's one of Friedman's arguments. But so here are a couple examples. So keep in mind that the U.S. and other rich countries had this kind of steady rise in average per capita growth rates, peaking in around the 60s, and then this steady decline afterwards. And you can see how cross-party cooperation, by this measure, this is from this book called The Upswing by Robert Putnam, who points out this coincidence but doesn't connect the dots, in my opinion. He kind of just says, well, if we fixed all these things, we would grow again, right? So cross-party cooperation kind of rises and falls with growth. Deaths of despair falls and then rises, kind of oppositely to growth. Income inequality, this is a reversed axis, so lower is higher inequality, and so inequality falls and then rises as our growth rises and then falls. And then this is estimates of the cultural salience of agreement, compromise, and unity using word rates in books. There are other measures that this book talks about that show a similar thing. So periods of high social cohesion, people tend to have less diversity in the names that they give their children, and that kind of the diversity in children's names falls and then rises in this pattern. This is the Financial Times 2 weeks ago, maybe, where he's plotted a graph kind of similar to mine, except he's looking at the average growth rate, I think, across countries, just in rich countries. And then he's using a different measure of democracy instead of the fraction of people living in a democracy, which arguably would be a lagging indicator of democratic backsliding. He's using this liberal democracy index and basically says, the pattern that I point out in this paper and my colleagues has maybe started to go in reverse. And so he wonders aloud in his paper if the Mark Carney's Prime Minister of Canada's statement about the New World Order is kind of more of a general, non-specific to the current foreign policy of the current U.S. administration than maybe some people think. This is also the same Financial Times reporter, John Burr Murdoch, who's fantastic, and I highly recommend following. He made this graph based on a paper that came out after ours. So we didn't talk about this in our paper. But this paper shows basically that how much of a zero-sum mindset you have in terms of how people answer survey questions and how that relates to their ideology about how much they think basically somebody has to lose for them to win and vice versa, is strongly correlated with how slow or fast the average GDP per capita growth was when they were a young adult. So the way to read this graph is the slower growth was when you were a young adult, the more of a zero-sum mindset you have. And this study and others has also shown that zero-sum mindsets are correlated and associated with being with higher rates of political extremism, higher rates of political polarization. Okay, so that's the first story about growth being important to our material and moral progress. Economic growth is environmentally unsustainable is the second story. And one way to look at this is the growth drives the energy intensity of the global economy has been going down. So, energy per dollar GDP has been going down by about half every 50 years, but still the overall energy footprint of the economy has been growing as the world economy has been growing. And we've made some progress with renewables in the last couple decades, but it's still a pretty small fraction of the global energy mix. And so it's still the case that we're increasing many demands in our environment as our economies get bigger. And some people argue it's unsustainable. One paradigm or version of this that I think illustrates the potential trade-off quite nicely is Kate Raworth's Donut Economics. So this is a recent paper that she wrote with Fanning, her collaborator, but she has this famous book called Donut Economics, which talks about how, imagine you have your ecological limits to how much environmental impact the planet can sustain on the outside, but we need at least a certain size of economy to give us all these nice social and material, have those needs met that we like, and that's the inside. And so basically her argument is we want our economy to live inside this green donut. And then they've tried to quantify in red kind of where are we overshooting the targets that she and her colleagues have decided, or the targets we should focus on, and then red on the inside is kind of where are we falling short of meeting the needs of people, particularly in poor regions. And this graph on the right is kind of these same measures, but sort of stretched out. And what they're showing is if you compare, pink to red on the bottom and then red to darker red on the top is kind of where we're going. And broadly, what we're seeing is in a lot of cases, the environmental impacts are getting worse, with a couple of exceptions, and the social and economic impacts are getting better, right? And so that maybe represents the trade-off that the first 2 points that I made show. The other thing that's really interesting, which isn't mutually exclusive to an argument like Raworth's that we're exceeding targets and the economy is not on pace to hit the targets. But one interesting thing that's become more and more apparent recently is in places where we are reducing on a large scale in absolute value environmental impacts, it's almost always in rich countries. So this, for example, is a plot from the website Our World in Data showing which countries have, since 2005, increased their economy size in blue per capita and decreased their CO2 emissions. And the CO2 emissions, I think, accounts for imports. So it's not like you're reducing it just by exporting or offshoring. And again, there are a couple exceptions, right? Nicaragua, Nigeria are not rich countries that have this pattern, but almost every other country that has this pattern is rich. I have this great PhD student named Ashley Dancer, who's co-advised by Steve Miller, who's one of my former colleagues when I was at University of Colorado, where we're trying to look at where are there environmental Kuznets curves. So the famous environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis is that when we're really poor, we don't have much environmental impact because we're poor. And then as we get richer, our environmental impact goes up. And then past a certain point, our technology starts to get so good and our needs start to get met. And so our preferences for environment start to go up. And as a result, our impacts start to come down. And so we basically looked across these 9 different impacts. Do we see evidences of environmental Kuznets curves? And do we see evidence of just one or of technological leapfrogging? So are some countries kind of going on a higher impact curve and other countries kind of coming on a lower impact curve, kind of peaking at lower impact? And what we see is, something that looks like the Kuznets curve, maybe for CO2 emissions in the top left, maybe something that looks like a Kuznets curve for energy use. SO2 emissions is the classic example in the literature of Kuznets curve, and it seems like there's some good evidence of leapfrogging. So the middle income countries are not polluting themselves as much as we did at their worst. Agricultural land use is actually per capita broadly falling, and agricultural land use period is falling in a lot of rich countries, even as our yields go up. So that's good news. Maybe we have a Kuznets curve for nitrogen, maybe for phosphorus. Fisheries, we maybe have leapfrogging. We're not really getting better at biodiversity, at least on this measure. I would argue that other measures tell a more complicated story. And then probably the one that is the trickiest is material footprint. So it's like, how much are we using? The only kind of real big drop in material footprint you see here in rich countries, kind of towards the end, is basically caused by the housing bubble. So we're building more houses than the economy could support, and then the market crashed, and we stopped building houses for a while. And maybe we're leveling off, but it's sort of not obvious that our material footprint is coming down as we get richer yet. So, I guess what I'm saying is you could look at this and say the glass is half full. We're going to, eventually reduce our environmental impact enough. Or you could look at this and say the glass is half empty and growth is not sustainable. And, I leave that to you to decide. Okay. And then the third story is that economic growth is slowing down permanently and we can't stop it. I want to try to leave time for questions, so I took out a bunch of slides that went into like the mechanics of this in more detail, because this is something that I've geeked out a bit on in my research. But the short version of the story is, which I've told you before already, is that we basically didn't have any per capita growth before the industrial revolutions. Then it came up, and then we had, this disruptions with the world wars and the Great Depression, and then we had these two big peaks of China and India over here and the OECD over here, and all the major economic forecasts agree that we're going to slow down compared to where throughout the century compared to where we were at the beginning of the century, and the current trajectory is at the low end of all of these scenarios. This would have to be a whole nother talk. The obvious question is AI going to fix that? I think the answer is probably no, at least for several decades. Some people disagree with me. I think they're wrong. Happy to discuss afterwards. Nobody can know, right? Predictions are hard, especially about the future. But why is this happening? Why do we have this decline that we've seen? This is something that's fairly well understood, I would argue, by economists. And basically, when you come down from being a middle income country to being a rich country and beyond, the main things that cause the slowdown are populations aging. So fertility rates tend to come down as you get richer. And so you have fewer, new brains being born to be your future generators of ideas and young workforces. You have aging populations that put pressure on the social safety net. And then the second big reason is going from middle income to rich. You tend to shift your economy from being more goods based to more service based, and it's just harder to increase productivity in services. And not only that, increasing productivity in goods increases the cost of labor inputs to services, which makes it even worse. And I'll show a graph on what that is doing to young people in a second. And then there are other things that are kind of less important, but also very hard to stop. So educational attainment doesn't increase growth forever, and you have a finite lifetime. You can't be in school forever and still be in the workforce. Urbanization increases growth, but you can't have more than 100% of people in cities, right? It's a one-way trip. Women entering the workforce is good for growth, but you can't have more than 100% of women in the workforce. And already men are leaving faster than women are entering. And actually now I think women themselves in some sectors are leaving faster than they're entering. And the point is, these are the main reasons driving the bus. And these people, and others who wrote these three books basically argue that these things are either hard or impossible to stop or very unpalatable, right? So, Vollrath says, like, if the fact that we don't need more stuff is one of the things driving us into buying services, we don't want to undo that and buy a bunch of fridges we don't need just so we can have a higher GDP per capita growth. And similar for if the thing that's driving birth rates down is women's rights and female education, then we wouldn't undo that to have a couple more points of growth either. It's kind of the argument. Yeah, okay. Then there's other, Gordon also thinks that we've picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit in innovation. Some people disagree with him. Some people think AI is going to prove him wrong. I'm not going to get into that. The point is, it doesn't matter who's right. These things are still kind of the big things. And then depending on where you are, inequality is not always bad for growth. It's not always good for growth. But some people argue that there's too much inequality in the US, and debt is the same. Public debt is the same. The other thing that's related is it's not just birth rates go down as you get richer. That's true. Particularly in the last 10 to 20 years, birth rates have been falling everywhere at once, faster than they did before. This is a really nice graph from The Economist, I think based on the work by an economist named Jesus Fernandez Villaverde at Penn, basically showing that like this is the trend, right, that you're seeing on the left in different regions in fertility, and then the UN is assuming the dashed line, right? So you have in a lot of places really sharp declines that the UN says are basically going to stop overnight. And then what's showing on the right is, if they stop within 5 years, if the UN sort of is wrong and then 5 years they become right, you get the blue line based on the UN variant, and then 15 and 25 years. And the point is you could have, there's some scenarios that are not that far-fetched that have, a global population being similar in the end of the century to it is today, and, China losing more than half of its population in this century in some, its current population in some scenarios, which just has, I think, wild implications for geopolitics, the economy, and the environment. One of the social health-related implications it has is that as our populations age, the government spending on old age benefits has gone way up, and the spending on investment has gone down a little bit, right? And if you think of public investment as things that support long-term growth, that maybe support opportunity for the young, you see this trade-off. An acquaintance of mine calls it provocatively, I think, total boomer luxury communism. You can imagine how that gets clicked. Okay, climate change. My colleague and frequent collaborator Roger Pilkey Jr. has this great blog post in his blog from a little over a year ago, where he says, okay, let's take this climate change scenario, SSP2 4.5, which is similar to UN and others' current policy scenarios. This scenario gives us about 2 3/4 centigrade warming above pre-industrial by 2100. If you just take that scenario and then give it more realistic GDP and population growth assumptions, and assuming everything else stays the same, you might actually get close to hitting the Paris target. Just basically from having less growth. So we're sort of degrowthing by accident, or not degrowthing. We're just growing slower. Anyway, so to wrap this part of the talk, I just want to again point out that there are these 3 stories about growth. That growth is really important, that it's unsustainable environmentally, and that it's slowing down for reasons we're not going to be able to stop. And if this is true, and either of these are true, then we should be thinking hard about how do we how do we prevent the progress from going in reverse as our growth slows down? So my colleagues and I wrote this paper, again, 5 years ago in Nature and Human Behavior, basically pointing this problem out and talking about a little bit more speculatively what some of the problems and some of the solutions might be. And as I mentioned, it basically landed with a dull thud until 2 or 3 weeks ago when the Financial Times picked it up. So we'll see if people start talking about it now. But what are some challenges, more specifically? I've kind of hinted at some. One is public finance. So if you think of, roughly speaking, your burden of debt as, being your debt divided by your GDP, how much money do you owe divided by, how much money do you make, roughly. There's 2 ways to shrink that. You can shrink that by having a surplus, running a surplus and reducing the size of the numerator, or you can shrink it by growing and increasing the size of the denominator. And historically, our debt to GDP here in red has gone up and down and up again. But basically driven by growth. On the bottom, I'm plotting deficits as a percentage of GDP from this Bloomberg article. And the point is, below the line is when we've been in surplus. We had a little bit of surplus right after World War II, and then a little bit of surplus at the end of the Clinton administration. And other than that, we basically only run deficits. And if our growth keeps slowing down, then we're going to have more fiscal discipline, or else the debt is eventually going to get unsustainable, particularly if we leave the low interest rate paradigm that we've been in for the last 15 to 20 years. Okay, other social challenges that we talk about in the paper. Rising inequality. So again, a slow growth society is more zero sum. I'm glossing over the mechanics of this a little bit, but an intuitive way to think about it is rich people are maybe better. If you have to make somebody poorer to make yourself richer, rich people are maybe better and more positioned to do that than poor people are. And so you might see some inequality in that situation. Whereas if you're growing, maybe that drives up the price of labor, which, we need to keep the party going. We need to make more concessions to things like organized labor, for example. Glossing over some details, but that's kind of a good intuitive gist. Opportunity for youth. I'm going to talk about this more in a second. Challenges to family formation, right? So you see birth rates going down. Possibly, there's a bunch of causes of that. If you get richer, right, then you have more opportunity costs, and so your birth rates go down. But in the short run, if you're growing slow enough that young people are having trouble getting housing and getting into the labor market and things like that, that makes marriage and family formation more difficult. Mental health challenges, at least historically, you especially see that in some countries among young men. Or not just young men, also older men. So you see that, for example, the suicide rate jumps up in Japan during their long-term stagnation. In this paper, we compared the U.S. situation to Japan and Italy, and we picked Japan and Italy because they are both different from each other and from the U.S., but they're also rich countries that have had, at the point we're writing, 2 decades or more of very slow per capita growth. And so the other thing that's interesting from the contrast of Japan and Italy is you can see that some of the challenges are not inevitable, right? So you see this big spike in the male suicide rate in Japan. You don't really see the same thing in Italy. Italy's period of stagnation starts around 2000. On the flip side, in Italy, you see massive youth unemployment. You don't really see that in Japan. In the U.S., you see a little bit of an increase in the male suicide rate following the Great Recession. Why do we think this is? Italy seems to protect itself, we argue, from these mental health challenges of high unemployment by having nice weather, a culture where unattached old people and young people are encouraged to live with relatives, and those are the 2 most high-risk groups, and also a kind of work-life balance culture. Japan, which has lower youth unemployment, one of the big problems that Italy has is they have kind of last one in, first one out labor agreements in a lot of their society. And so when there's kind of an economic downturn, the young people tend to hit hardest. Whereas Japan have a cultural expectation of you work really hard, but also there's a lot of social pressure in companies to not lay people off every time there's a downturn. And so maybe you sort of get kind of opposite strengths and weaknesses in those countries. Gender specific challenges. I mentioned male mental health. For women, if things, female specific social benefits, social safety nets, like paid parental leave, subsidized childcare as being 2 examples. Those often require government financial support, and slow growth can strain public finances, and those kinds of things can be, among the first to go, for example, as we saw in Sweden in the early 90s. Declining social trust. I'm going to talk about this in a second, and then gaps between expectation and reality. And again, the trust thing I think is pretty obvious related to the zero sum. Okay, I want to drill on youth a little bit because I think that's key to some of the health issues, but also some of the unrest. So it's not just growth slowing and being zero sum, it's also relative to expectations. right? So if your parents and your grandparents grew up in a really fast growth time and you have this idea that you're going to be a lot richer than your parents and your grandparents, and then you're not, even if you're a little bit richer than your parents and your grandparents, it still might be that that you're doing less well than you expected, and that makes you upset. Additionally, if growth slows faster than we expect, then people's retirement savings on average are going to grow slower than they expect, which means they're going to retire later, and that squeezes young people in the labor market. If there's less growth than we expect, then maybe there's going to be less hiring than we expected. That squeezes young people from the other end. Housing is unaffordable in many places. Eventually, declining populations make that better, as we're seeing in a lot of parts of Japan, but not initially. And where gaps between expectation and reality fuel unrest, interestingly, it's not among the poor. It's among upper middle class youth. And that's something that you see in the current US, but also throughout history. And then, yeah, eventually populations can be good for the labor market and the housing market, but not right away. Okay, this is related to young people being squeezed, and it's also related to the shift from goods to services, right? So what you're seeing is the cost compared to the early 90s of manufactured goods has been falling, and the cost of service-intensive things has been rising. The problem is college tuition, right, and fees is here. Housing is rising a bit. I think that, I want to say I've seen other things where it's rising more. Certainly in some cities, it's rising more. Childcare has risen a lot. Medical care has risen a lot, which maybe isn't such a big deal for the young, but is indirectly a fiscal big deal because of the demands for healthcare for older people. This is an example, illustrating the current U.S. context, how you see you're likely to see unrest driven by disaffected elites as opposed to the masses. The political extremes on both ends in the United States are disproportionately white, educated, and rich, is what this is showing. And for those of you who saw me talking my talk on Monday, I talked about a little bit why that is, but I don't have time. But I think if you think about it enough, it sort of scans probably with your life. Okay, let's add climate change to the mix again. So, there's a lot of uncertainty about the climate economy relationship. This is another thing that I give a whole talk on. The estimates of how much damage the economy climate change is doing range from literally it's benefiting the economy in a couple studies to it's, catastrophically harming the economies. My take is there's irreducible model uncertainty as evidenced by that range of estimates. And so we should be considering deep uncertainty. Again, the relationship between the climate change and the economy and our ability to adapt to it and mitigate it is also complicated because as much as our economy produces emissions, it also produces technology. Growth produces infrastructure turnover, which makes adaptation and retrofitting and mitigation, retrofitting cheaper, and makes government spending easier. Climate change is affecting physical, mental health, which I'll talk about in a second. But one thing that I want to stress is that even if you take the worst damage estimates and the most pessimistic growth estimates, you still have the world in 2100 being richer just about everywhere by quite a lot than it is today. So the idea that the possibility that climate change will damage the economy in ways that are important that we should try to prevent is a significant probability. But the probability that climate change, based on what we currently know, will make us poorer in 2100 than we are today is very, very small. And I mention that because there are some narratives in the media about climate change that are very apocalyptic that I think are contributing to the mental health crisis more than the facts of the impacts, particularly in rich countries, are. Okay. Another thing that's really important, and I would argue underappreciated, my colleagues and I just published a working paper about this, is that if you imagine decomposing the trend in some thing that we care about in society, like crop yields, that's sensitive to climate change, if you decompose the time trend in that as, the effect of climate change times the rate of climate change, plus the effect of economic development times the rate of economic development, plus all the other terms, the development term is almost always by far the biggest. And so this is just an example illustrating this for crop yields. The log scale correlation at the level of World Bank income groups between cereal yields and GDP per capita is extremely strong. I've demeaned it to sort of get rid of pre-trend differences. And then this is based on a study that was published in Nature recently that I think was probably had some pessimistic assumptions, but even still, if you take this scenario, RCP 4.5, that's kind of roughly where we're headed under current policies, and compared to the background trend, you have something like, this much of an increase without climate change and this much of an increase with climate change. So you're talking about, being a little bit less better off because of climate change, which you should still care about. But in most measures, you're not talking about being worse off, except maybe in a few specific areas that we should pay attention to. Similarly, this is a plot of ours based on a paper by Formetta and Feyen, where they look at the death and damage rates from natural climate-related hazards, so floods, fires, heat, I believe, and wind and storms. Localized, so sort of, how much was the damage and death rate in 50-kilometer radius, 100-kilometer, 200-kilometer, 400-kilometer. Here we're plotting 200-kilometer, but they all basically look the same. They've gone down quite significantly. So it's not that climate change is not making some of these hazards more frequent and more severe, but so far we're adapting faster. Okay. Mitigation economics. This is a plot from the most recent IPCC report where each of these things is kind of something you can do to reduce emissions. The width of the bar tells you how much emissions you can reduce if we did it globally, and the color of the bar tells you how much it would cost. And all the blue things cost less than nothing, right? So if we make our buildings more efficient, if we adopt and deploy renewables that are already economically competitive, other things like that, we already make our economy better today, and so there's not even a trade-off. Even with the hard things, you're still talking about a trade-off, on the order of magnitude of military spending, and I would argue it's probably smaller than that when you account for things like technological improvement. Okay, back to health. Physical effects, obviously air pollution, pollution directly from burning fossil fuels. These things can be aided by technology. Heat stress, less cold stress, right? That's actually a benefit of climate change, and in increased burden of tropical infectious diseases in some places. And then I want to dwell on the mental health effects for a little bit. There's direct effects from climate disruptions, like air quality. There's some young adults in Montana who are suing the Trump administration over this. And then there's indirect effects from worrying about your climate future, which are occurring on an alarming scale. And I want to dwell on this a little bit, partly because it's a public health audience, but also partly just this is something I'm really concerned about. Youth mental health is a huge problem. So this is a plot from Jonathan Haidt's congressional testimony from a couple of years ago, showing that emergency room visits for self-inflicted injuries for teenagers is up, significantly, particularly among females. And this is from a survey that found that 4 in 10 young people said they were afraid to have children due to climate change. In the same survey, there were 45% of young people that said that climate anxiety affected their daily life and functioning. And I don't think that those numbers, it's not that climate change is nothing to worry about, but I don't think that the magnitude of those numbers makes sense just from the impacts. So for example, if you look at like what are you likely to die from, natural disaster deaths for the world are in the same order of magnitude per year as murder in just the United States. Murder in the world is about 10 times larger. Traffic accidents in the world is way larger. And then if you put it into the overall breakdown of things people die from, even murder is a small fraction of everything else, right? And so my implicit claim here is I wonder if young people are being taught to worry about the impacts of climate change, stopping them from being able to have a productive life, which I think just doesn't make sense anywhere in the United States, at least, because of messages that they're getting from media, from teachers, in some cases from professors. Okay. I'm going to come back to that once more quickly in a minute or two, and then hopefully leave 10 minutes at least for questions. So quick summary so far before I wrap up by talking about solutions. Economic growth is slowing, especially in rich countries. There's not evidence yet that AI is going to save us from that. And to the extent that it continues, the historical pattern has been increasing polarization, social tensions, and fiscal stress, all else equal, which have effects on health and climate change. climate change affects the economy, but the economy drives the bus in most climate sensitive outcomes. So, the economic term pulling our benefit outcomes up is, 5 to 10 times bigger or more than the climate effect kind of pulling it down at the margins. Again, at least historically. But the effects of climate change, which are real, and also the money that we need to spend to fix it, either by adapting or mitigating, could add some fiscal and social stress. And climate change and slowing growth both affect health in different ways. Okay, what do we do about it? Our paper was largely focused on the slow growth side, right, as opposed to the climate health side. But in the paper about slow growth, we call for a guided civic revival, and we call it that because this is what I named my Substack after: civic revival, because the government can't do it on its own. You need to have grassroots and cultural forces propping it up. And guided, because I think the government needs to play a role too by providing the right incentives for people. So what are the objectives of the guided civic revival? We argue that we need to improve return on investment in taxation and public spending, right? So for example, nobody likes paying taxes, but everybody, whether you're a deficit hawk or a spend more person, you should love the IRS. IRS enforcement agents have a 6-to-1 return for the federal government because of the tax, cheating that they save. And there are lots of other examples that we give. Basically, if balancing the budget is going to become more important, and we still want to have public services, and maybe the demand for public spending is going to go up, we need to be very disciplined about taxes and spending. I would, second provocation, argue that both liberals and conservatives should like sales taxes more than they currently do. Opportunity for youth. We need to think about how to make education better, cheaper, more accessible, and tailored. Right. Whatever you think about the current culture wars about DEI, for example, everybody, I think, agrees that cheap, accessible education is good for young people and good for equality. Reduce inequality, or buffer against increasing inequality if that's a consequence of slow growth. And we argue that where you are, that might require more pre-distribution. Right. So the U.S. actually spends quite a lot of money transferring money from rich to poor, but arguably doesn't get as much bang for it as Europe does, which funds things like free childcare and free healthcare that kind of redistribute instead of kind of making people pay for stuff and then giving them cash. Provide public services, and maybe, although this would make growth worse, as we're finding out, less globalization. And we wrote this in 21, so we're not shilling for the current government. Promoting integration and shared identities. If we can't, if we're not going to be bonded over the rising tide lifting all boats, we need to be bonded on something else. And we're lucky in the United States to have a country that is not founded as an ethnic nation state like many other countries in the world are. And so we can have a shared identity that isn't, ethno-nationalist in a way that's maybe harder in Japan or China or something. But we need to have a shared identity. We can't have this, our identities, we don't have one, or, we're all just atomized people, trying to make money or whatever. That's not going to work. Strengthen formal democratic institutions in case there's stress in democracy. That one seems pretty self-explanatory. And improve non-economic drivers of subjective well-being. The idea being, let's fill the gap with something else. I'm going to dwell. First, I'm going to say these are all no regrets objectives, right? So if we do all these things and I'm wrong about growth slowing down, then great, we're still better off. And the one I want to dwell on a little bit is this last one, because you're all public health people. So remember I showed this plot that life satisfaction is correlated with income. There are some things that are not economic that also correlate with well-being and life satisfaction. So a couple of examples I want to give. One is from this great paper by Benjamin et al., where they basically asked people a whole bunch of times to say which they preferred among different pairs of things, I believe, and then from that they backed out what are the things that are most important to people. And if you just look down this list, some of these things obviously have direct or indirect economic aspects, right? Like your financial security, but some obviously don't, like the happiness of your family, right? Your health, the quality of your family relationships, society helping the poor and others who struggle. I'll share the slides with Dr. Sims after, if you want to read through these in detail, just in the interest of time. But again, if you kind of go down, some of these things are clearly economic, some things are clearly not. Trust among people in your nation, the extent to which you feel things you do in your life are worthwhile, your physical safety and security. Okay. And then my final provocation is, so these are, based on people's stated preferences, what are non-economic drivers of well-being? Maybe if whoever's managing the chat can take some guesses. What do you think are 3 of the strongest correlates that are not related to, your economic condition of well-being and mental health in the United States? And my hint is that they, when I give this talk to, educated, academic, liberal audiences, they sometimes are surprising. No one's posting anything. Okay. Being married, being religious, and being conservative, politically conservative. So marriage is probably pretty obvious. That's, if you marry well, right, that's a super important relationship that buffers you against loneliness, has all kinds of benefits for, security, for the well-being of your children, and et cetera, et cetera. Religious participation, to be clear, I'm not aware of any empirical evidence that believing this or that about how the earth came to be affects your well-being, but the churches and religious communities provide really important social structures and senses of community and belonging and purpose, and those things are important, sort of regardless of whether you're this religion or that religion or the other religion. That's at least my read of the evidence. And then political conservative. Why is being political conservative associated with better mental health? This is actually something that's been true, as long as I've seen data collected. There's some evidence that the gap has increased in the last 10 years, and also by gender. So for example, this is a quite scary Pew survey that found that over 50% of 18 to 29-year-old left-leaning women said that a doctor had provided them with a mental health diagnosis. And that, I think, as somebody who teaches college, that should scare you, right? Those are your students, and you should hope that you're not contributing to that. What is causing this gap? Studies that I've seen attribute to beliefs in personal agency. Conservatives, on average, are more likely to believe that personal agency is important in their own and their others' well-being, and having an internal locus of control is, whether or not it's accurate description of the world, is good for your mental health to believe it, right? A positive outlook. Conservatives are more likely to be religious. And then these reasons are all ones that kind of conservatives like to hear. The ones that liberals like to hear, which also have some evidence for them, is system justification, right? And that just means if you're happy with the way that the current system works, which is more common among conservatives, then you're more likely to be happy, or you have one less thing to be unhappy about, right? One of the reasons I bring this up in the context of climate change and health is that, again, I do worry, for example, Musa Al-Gharbi, who wrote this article that this graph comes from, he argues that the messaging in the last 10 years in some liberal media and some liberal social media has really emphasized lack of agency, catastrophic outlooks on everything, binary thinking in ways that are not conducive to good mental health. John Hyten and Greg Lukianoff made a similar argument in the book, The Calling of the American Mind. So my final provocation before I take questions is Hannah Ritchie is this amazingly brilliant environmental scientist who wrote this good book called Not the End of the World. And she has this Wired article before the book called Stop Telling Kids They'll Die from Climate Change. And so please listen to her. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt. Excellent talk. Wide-ranging, poked a lot of buttons that I want to follow up on. I think, in thinking about having an economist come talk to us about kind of how economic factors are integrating with health and also integrating with climate change, I was leaning pretty heavily on the best piece of data that I'm familiar with in Idaho, this McClure Center report on the Idaho Economic Climate Impact Assessment, which was done in 2021. that showed how climate change is driving lots of challenges in our communities, especially small mountain towns like Sun Valley and McCall, that are primarily driven on tourism and snowpack for skiing and beautiful summer lakes. That are probably going to lose their snowpack by 2050, 2060 if climate change continues as it is now. How do you see that climate change is supposed to be adapted to in these small communities in ways that allow them to survive in face of these regional issues like wildfire smoke that comes from other places, perpetual drought that is driving a lot of these issues that we as a state don't have agency over, in a way that it doesn't even factor into the equation, the lack of ability to go outside because it's smoky and miserable in our summers, which is increasing every year.
Okay, I'm going to I'm going to encourage you and then depress you and then encourage you again. All right, so start with encouraging. I haven't seen the specific Idaho study that you're referencing, but one of my bugbears in climate economics is and climate impacts research in general is there's enormous overuse of this scenario called RCP 8.5 that is 50 to 100% more pessimistic in terms of warming than probably more realistic current policies ones are. So my first thing would be I would encourage Idahoans to look at that report and see if the 2060 no snow comes from RCP 8.5. And if it does, then you maybe have a couple more decades, right? Now, notice how I didn't say you have forever. So here's the depressing thing, right? If you're talking about climate impacts, especially locally, especially in the scale of the next few decades, adaptation, whether or not it can work, right, is basically the only thing you have, right? So just to give an example that we give in our adaptation paper, the temperature anomaly, which determines climate change, is pretty much linear in cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. The current global annual greenhouse gas emissions are about 2% of the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. The American greenhouse gas emissions are about 13% of 2% of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. Louisiana is the example used in the paper, but Idaho is probably even smaller, is 4% of 13% of 2% of global cumulative emissions. And so as one of the things we say in the paper is if Louisiana had freaked out after Hurricane Katrina and eliminated their fossil fuels greenhouse gas emissions overnight, they would have done approximately nothing for the risk of hurricanes over the next several decades. And unfortunately, that same thing is probably true for Idaho and your snow. What you guys do with your emissions is good for your air quality. It's good for your contribution to the world's solution to this problem. But it just what you do in Idaho with if you get off gas a little bit faster or not just is not going to affect your snow. There are some things that you can do technologically to adapt, right? I'm not a huge skier, probably like some of you are, but I'm enough of a skier to know that the fake snow now is way better than it was in the 90s, right? When I started skiing, and maybe that's cold comfort, no pun intended. There are some things like heat, Arizona does way better in terms of death with heat waves than Europe does, even though it's hotter because they all have air conditioning. There's a lot of like structural things that we can do to adapt. But there also are just going to be some hard things that we can't adapt to that are sad, right? There are definitely going to be some places that are not as good at ski resorts as they were, 20 years ago. And there's probably some limit to how much that we can stop that. And I always just tell my students that we don't, particularly in privileged parts of the world, we don't get to shy away from these hard choices, right? If somebody says that to meet 1.5 degrees, we have to be so drastic in cutting global emissions that we'd have to stop a bunch of Africa from developing, and somebody else says if we don't do that, the Maldives is going to be underwater in 100 years, right? It's possible that both of those things are true, and we can't say, well, it gives me too much anxiety to think about it, so I'm going to stick my head in the sand, especially if we don't live in either Africa or the Maldives. So yeah, I don't know if that's kind of hopeful or not, but that's my honest take.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jen Pierce asks a good question to follow up on that in the chat. That while I don't think we should tell kids that they're all going to die from climate change in Idaho, we're not teaching kids about climate change at all. Surely there's got to be a middle ground.
Yes, there is. I agree with you completely. Right. So I mean, it's the same thing. It's the same logic that I just gave for, don't lie about the Maldives or the development trade-offs because you don't want to imagine hard choices. That same thing applies to people who don't want to admit that climate change is real, right? Catherine Hayhoe, I think, who's a famous climate scientist and fellow Canadian, says, the thermometer doesn't care whether you're Democrat or Republican, and she's absolutely right, right? And there are a lot of places, in rural America, I think is actually a really, especially maybe in the West, is a really interesting case study of where you're seeing some of the worst impacts of climate change in terms of things like water security, in terms of things like drought, and heat for ranchers and farmers. But they're all, you're also on the front lines in rural America of the economic opportunities of the solutions, right? So the Kevin McCarthy, for example, former Republican Speaker of the House, represents the second biggest renewable producing congressional district in the country. One of the reasons the subsidies of inside the Inflation Reduction Act have been more lasting and more popular than some people thought they would be is that I think something like 80% of the money was going to Republican districts, not because Biden is a cynical politician or a generous, benevolent person, although maybe he is in some ways. The main reason is you build solar and wind in rural areas, and rural areas tend to be represented by Republicans. So I think we absolutely just have to teach people the facts. And my argument for less doom is less doom that's inconsistent with the facts.
So why do you think it is then that a lot of these rural areas that are benefiting from new technology and have the ability not just to benefit financially, but also in terms of their quality of life being improved by better air quality, cleaner water, less temperature variability? Why do you think these communities are not seeing this and buying into new technology and clean energy?
Well, I would say the answer is it depends, and it's complicated, right? So it depends in the sense that like some communities absolutely are, right? So there's solar booms happening all over the Southeast. Texas is the biggest producer of wind in the country. Wyoming, where I'm from, has lots of wind, has lots of rare earths, is pushing some of the new nuclear projects that are coming online. So some places are getting these things. In a lot of places, either there's kind of at a granular level, winners and losers. So the coal community over here stands to lose, and the neighboring county, stands to gain wind and solar. Or there's some places where it's just complicated. Like I remember I used to go to Western Colorado a lot when I was working at University of Colorado, and there you would hear things like, the liberals in the Front Range are trying to put wolves in our backyard, and they're trying to stop us from accessing our shale gas resources, which they're actually sitting on a very large shale deposit in Western Colorado. But particularly when the cameras are off, you hear all kinds of stories about Democrats and Republicans working together, really productively on water issues, surrounding ranches and farms. I don't know as much about the solar economy out there, but I can imagine that there's lots of opportunities for that. And so I think people are smarter than we give them credit for and sort of understand the local cost benefits more than we do give them credit for. And also, but I think beyond the cost benefits, people also just like to be respected. And so, the worst thing that you can do if you're, somebody from Boise going out into the rural parts of your state is to say, when someone says that a particular climate policy has a potential effect on their livelihood, ask them a question about that. Don't say, oh, Exxon propaganda is the only reason you believe that, or something like that.
Yeah, I really like the fact that you shouted out two of my heroes, both Hannah Ritchie and Catherine Hayhoe. I actually got to see Hannah speak yesterday on a climate conversation, and she does maintain optimism in the face of working at our world in data and seeing all of the climate data that is out there that scares a lot of us. One last question that we're a little bit over time, but I think I'd like to hear your answer to it from an audience member. While deaths directly attributable to extreme heat extreme weather like tornadoes and hurricanes are low, how do we consider the increased likelihood of death from other causes like heart disease, respiratory diseases, et cetera, that result from especially poor air quality and extreme heat, but other climate-driven problems? How do those factor in? I think there's a lot of health studies that have shown how we tease out how those specific criteria are causing human health impacts, but I don't think there's as much of that consideration in the economic data you presented now.
I think that's broadly true. I mean, certainly, yes, there are lots of studies that show or that estimate indirect mortality and morbidity impacts from climate change, kind of beyond the specific areas I mentioned. Now, there are also a ton of indirect mortality and morbidity estimates from being poor, right? And so the main point I was making about us needing to think carefully about the importance of the economy and economic well-being to these indirect things, including climate-sensitive outcomes, I think still applies to things like mortality from disease, for example, right? Richer societies have better healthcare. But absolutely, I mean, the clean energy is just that, right? It's clean, and there's lots of benefits, to the extent that solar power reduces air pollution. That's just good, whether or not we care about greenhouse gas emissions, right? And so I think the more that we can look for these kinds of win-wins for health and the environment and the economy, the better it will be.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a point that another person I really respected in the climate space, Jonathan Foley from Project Drawdown, talks a lot about, is the optimism of the future that's available to us if we take advantage of the solutions that are already present now. And I think the frustrating thing for me is that economy is used as a cudgel to fight against progress in a lot of these climate-based solutions. And I think people are misinterpreting the opportunity that's available with things like wind and solar, with things that make our air quality and water quality better, with even, dare I say, regulations that can help improve the health and the climate of environments we live in. I think there are so many economic co-benefits to that will make us more prosperous and not hinder our economic progress. And I struggle with how economy is always used as a counter to climate progress, as opposed to a co-benefit of climate solutions.
One just quick point I'll make on that is, in the areas which are plentiful and under-tapped still, where there is a win-win, that synergy cuts both ways, right? So if you do, industrial policy and make renewables cheaper and more accessible, that has economic benefits. Manufacturing actually boomed quite a lot in the second half of the Biden administration, for example. But the same goes the other way, right? If renewables are, which they are in a lot of places, cost competitive and waiting to get on the grids and make our energy cheaper, you have situations like in Texas where even though sometimes they've had governments that have made noises that sound like they don't like renewables, they also have climates that are generally pro-business, and that's why renewables are thriving there. And that's why Texas, red states generally have cheaper electricity right now than blue states. And some of the biggest renewable producers are red states. And again, I'm not saying that red states are better than blue states or blue states are better than red states. The point is just that, in these areas which are plentiful and becoming more plentiful by the day, where the economy and the climate change and the environment are synergistic, you can pick whichever one you like better and pull on it, and you have a good chance of helping both.
But why can't we break the wall between those two sentiments and have red Republicans talk about the economic benefits of climate tech, and liberal Democrats talk about how climate solutions can be economically beneficial?
I think in some areas, certainly not in the kind of extremely online culture wars, but there are a lot of areas you do that. So on Monday, in the geosciences department, I was talking about climate polarization, and I mentioned a study that by my former student Renee Marshall, where she found over 100 bills passed by Republicans to reduce emissions in places like Georgia, and they often had titles like the Solar Freedom Act and the Solar Access Act, and so I guess what I'm saying is, and there are lots of liberals who talk about the economic benefits of clean tech, right? John Foley, he's not a politician, but being an example, right? Catherine Hayhoe being an example. So Yeah, I guess my answer would be yes, and a lot of people are doing that. They just unfortunately still don't get as many clicks and likes as people who are trying to divide us.
Yeah, so get offline is the bottom
Yeah,
line.
exactly.
Okay, well, thank you for a really interesting chat, Matt. I appreciate your time. I'm glad you came to Boise to visit BSU. I'm sorry we didn't have a big audience for you here at St. Luke's, but just the nature of our lecture series that we're mostly an online community. So maybe don't get completely offline. But there will be a post event survey, and if everyone can fill that out, and I'll chat with Matt about how we can get some of the slides to be accessible for folks after the talk. So thanks again for a great chat, and we'll see you on March 4th to talk about infectious disease and climate change.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and thanks for organizing this series, Dr. Sims.
Yeah. Yeah.